Good morning. I decided what I was going to do was to tell you a story, a little bit earlier in the day than telling. Now, mind you, this is ghost stories from the world with Omen, and we're still in the Philippines. Now, I did a little researching and found out about a creature well known to the Filipinos known as the Pujo, or Pugot, if I'm saying it wrong. I'll spell it Pugot, and a song which I think you should play for the little ones. I'm going to play it for you now. Alright, now that we've set the tone, let us begin. Now, let me give you a little bit of background on the Pujo. Now, Pujo, evolution of the headless Filipino ghost. Now, pardon me if I mispronounce any of these words. Among the Ilocanos and Pampangues, the Pujo was a nocturnal spirit, usually in the form of a gigantic Negro figure, terrifying but not particularly harmful. It corresponded to the Tagalog Capre, which eventually took ownership of the Pujo's early attributes. Its power of rapid transformation made it a more or less formidable opponent. Sometimes it took the form of a cat with fiery eyes, a minute later appearing as a large dog. Then it would turn into an enormous black Negro smoking a large cigar, and finally disappear as a ball of fire. It lived either in large trees or in abandoned houses. Various Ayeta groups in northern Luzon are known as Pujo or Pujo, an Ilocano term that came to be known as goblin or forest spirit, and is the colloquial term for people with darker complexions. The earliest belief of the Pujo spirit is found in Ilocano myths as the spirits of ancestral aborigines, Ayetas, who guard treasures. Suac and his adventures, a Pugot folk tale. This story is from Anastasia Villegas of Arayat, Pampanga, who heard the tale from her grandmother. So this might be a true one, folks. Once upon a time, in a certain town in Pampanga, there lived a boy named Suac. In order to try his fortune, one day he went hunting with Sunga and Saku in Mount Telapayong. When they reached the mountain, they spread their nets and made their dogs ready for the chase, to see if any wild animals would come to that place. Not long afterwards, they captured a large hog. They took it under a giant tree and killed it. Then Sunga and Suac went out into the forest again. Saku was left to prepare their food. While he was busy cooking, he heard a voice saying, "Ha ha, what a nice meal you are preparing. Hurry up, I'm hungry." On looking up, Saku saw on the top of the tree a horrible creature, a very large black man with a long beard. This was Pugot. Saku said to him, "Abba, I am not cooking this food for you. My companions and I are hungry." "Well, let us see who shall have it then," said Pugot as he came down the tree. At first, Saku did not want to give him the food, but Pugot knocked the hunter down, and before he had time to recover, had eaten up all the food. Then he climbed the tree again. When Sunga and Suac came back, Sunga said to Saku, "Is the food ready? Here is a deer that we have caught." Saku answered, "When the food was ready, Pugot came and ate it all. I tried to prevent him, but in vain. I could not resist him." "Well," said Sunga, "let me be the cook while you and Suac are the hunters." Then Saku and Suac went out, and Sunga was left to cook. The food was no sooner ready than Pugot came again and ate it all as before. So when the hunters returned, bringing a hog with them, they still had nothing to eat. Accordingly, Suac was left to cook, and his companions went away to hunt again. Suac roasted the hog. Pugot smelled it. He looked down and said, "Ha ha! I have another cook. Hurry up, boy, I'm hungry. I pray you, please do not deprive of us this food too," said Suac. "I must have it, for I am hungry," said Pugot. "Otherwise I shall eat you up." When the hog was roasted a nice brown, Pugot came down the tree, but Suac placed the food near the fire and stood by it. And when Pugot tried to seize it, the boy pushed him into the fire. Pugot's beard was burnt, and it became kinky. The boy then ran to a deep pit. He covered it on the top with grass. Pugot did not stay to eat the food, but followed Suac. Suac was very cunning. He stood on the opposite side of the pit and said, "I pray you, do not step on my grass." "I am going to eat you up," said Pugot angrily as he stepped on the grass and fell into the pit. The boy covered the pit with stones and earth, thinking that Pugot would perish there, but he was mistaken. Suac had not gotten far when he saw Pugot following him, but just then he saw, too, a crocodile. He stopped and resolutely waited for Pugot, whom he gave a blow and pushed into the mouth of the crocodile. Thus, Pugot was destroyed. Suac then took his victim's club and returned under the tree. After a while, his companions came back. He related to them how he had overcome Pugot, and then they ate. The next day, they returned to town. Suac, on hearing that there was a giant who came every night into the neighborhood to devour people, went one night to encounter the giant. When the giant came, he said, "You are just the thing for me to eat." But Suac gave him a deadly blow with Pugot's club, and the giant tumbled down dead. Later, Suac rid the islands of all the wild monsters and became the ruler over his people. Now, this can be interpreted in two different ways: supernaturally, and also as it probably is more accurately depicted. Now, I'm pretty sure in the language of the Philippines, or the terms, Negro probably refers to the same thing Negro usually refers to, which is people of African descent. Not necessarily African American descent, but African descent. Because chances are, if they're in the Philippines, they're probably at that time not of African American descent, but very much could be of African descent. So let's clear that up right there. You've got the native peoples of the Filipino Islands, and perhaps, some African travelers. Now, of course, regionally, people are of different sizes. So when these native Filipino people saw these Africans, they were larger, looked different. They hadn't seen anything like this before. So it is not, it's not uncommon to believe that they probably saw them as monsters, right? Now, where the headless thing came from, I'm not sure. Maybe the African settlers that came to the Philippines way along those times may have been wearing some type of a headdress that made it seem as if they were headless. Now, as far as them hiding in trees and shit like that, well, there are people who are used to living on the land as well, just not that land. So what probably transpired there with the stealing of their dinners is, the African travelers came in there, didn't really understand the language, obviously, and the culture, the food. What could you eat? What could you not eat? Maybe they ate some shit and they fucked them up, and they were like, "Oh God, I'm not eating that shit again. We gotta find some people around here. Obviously, they're eating stuff." So they probably went into the villages, and instead of just killing everyone, because they realized that these people seen them as maybe monsters or gods or whatever, they probably figured, hey, let's play on that. Let's play on it, and they probably started tricking the people into the food. Now, Suac obviously was some dude that was like, yo, look, these dudes aren't monsters. There's nothing special about them. They bleed just like we bleed. Fuck them, right? And decided, I'm going to rid my little chain of islands of these invaders, right? Now, that's one thing that it possibly could be. And of course, over time, stories change, details are added, details are omitted, and at some point, in order for him to solidify his control of, the islands and such, maybe the story was told that these were large, gigantic monsters, and that is what he, conquered. Then there's the story that I found out. Now, I know what you guys are probably saying. The one that you just said sounds pretty accurate. People back then didn't know of other people and other cultures and other races, and therefore another race would be a monster to them. But, folks, trust me, if it was that simple, would I be telling this story? Of course not. Nothing is ever simple. But it is not simple. Right? So here's what happened. Now, once again, I'm already chilling up in Quezon City as Rafael Ramos, you know what I'm saying? So I've got my connections. I've built up a little name for myself as the guy that goes out and finds out about all these things that people are scared to death of, and I let you know whether you should still be scared to death of it for the reasons that you're scared to death of it, or if you should be scared to death of it for other reasons, right? Or not be scared to death of it at all because it's some bullshit. Like the whole flying coffin thing. Nothing to be scared of, simply Ubers for ghosts, right? As long as you don't get hit in the head by one, you're alright. So, let me tell you what I found out as I traveled to the region known as the area of Pugot, right? Or Pugot, as you say. Or Pugot, or Pugot, whatever, Pugot. So, I head to the region like I told you, got myself a guide. His name, I don't remember. I'm sorry, I tell you, because he's actually a pretty cool guy. We were talking about all types of stuff. And he explained to me the legend of the Pugot. Now, it was somewhat exactly what it is that I told you in the first place. A group of African settlers, not sure where they were from, came to the islands of the Philippines in this particular region, right? Now, I'm listening to this guy tell the story. Of course, I'm having another one of those really delicious tropical drinks that I like so much. Anyway, back to what I was saying. Bam. The guy, right, is telling me the things that I need to know. He says a group of African settlers came there a long time ago, like way back when there were still little tribes and stuff. No real organization, right? Now, this group of settlers came, and at first everything was fine. You know, the natives gave them a small parcel of land and allowed them to, settle. Now, they didn't go there willingly, meaning the African settlers weren't landing there intentionally. It just so happened a storm came up. I think it was a monsoon. Rains, winds were terrible, blew them way off course. They ended up landing there, right? So things are going well. The leader or chieftain of the African villagers, settlers, speaks to the head of the Filipino village, right? And says, hey, listen, we love your hospitality. You guys have been wonderful. Thank you so fucking much. Or we would have died out there and more than likely died here. You've taught us much, but we must return to our homeland. Do you have any idea how to get back to this particular place? He tells them and explains to them the land that he's from, and they've never even heard of lands covered with seas of sand and things of that nature. A land with no water, a land with no trees. They were flabbergasted. They couldn't believe such a place existed. And it started to make them wonder, wait a minute, these people come from a land with nothing. No trees, no dirt, no soil to grow things, no water to drink. Some of the villagers started to, feel as if these visitors weren't being 100% honest about what their true intentions were, right? A group of them got together and began planning and preparing for the worst, just in case these things transpired as they were thinking in their heads. And they would be right, but not for the reasons which they thought. Now, remember, the African settlers have been living there now for probably about 2 years. You know what I'm saying? The time back then to recover from certain things was a lot longer than it is now. So they were there for a while. They had learned some of the customs of the people that they were around had learned some of the customs from them, but there were still many of the native Filipinos who were not accepting of these new guests. Now, the leader of the African settlers finally realized that the chances of him making it back home were slim to none. It wasn't going to happen, there's just no way. Number one, the type of wood they needed to build a ship capable of faring the seas to where they had to go was not available there, and not in the abundance. They didn't know how to work with this type of wood, totally different makeup and everything. So, they were at a loss. So, they decided, the chieftain of the African settlers said, hey, listen, you've given us this parcel of land. Thank you so much. You've taught us how to live on this land. We think that maybe we should go off on our own, if you don't mind. That the leader of the native Filipinos was perfectly okay with that. Said, hey, listen, maybe there will be things in the future that you can teach us. And, they parted ways. And everything was fine for now. Another year or two goes by. They're living in harmony and peace with one another. They've taught each other language, right? They've taught each other the languages from their native land. And you're probably asking, how did they communicate in the first place if they couldn't speak the same language? Well, believe it or not, the language of need and necessity is pretty much universal. People, when they need food, can simply point to their mouth and stomach, and people understand. But anyway, that's not the point. Remember, they've been there 2 years. You're going to learn some stuff about each other, especially when you have to for 2 years. So, the native languages of each were melded, and those who had become, cool with the people, the African settlers, they had a language that only the two of them could speak. Like the Africans could speak this mishmash of their native language with the native language of the Filipinos. So here they have this language. Everything seems good, right? You're wondering, well, where do the stories of the evil Negro monster come from? I'm getting there. Hold your horses. Okay? Now, here's where things start to get a little bit muddled historically as well. I couldn't find any direct evidence supporting this. This is basically speculation, but it does make some bit of sense. Now remember, you had some of the natives who weren't accepting or inviting or willing to allow the African settlers to stay on their land. They weren't happy that this group now was not just staying to itself. You know, only a few women came or survived from the African settlers group, maybe two of them. Now, in ancient cultures, it was customary to marry off one women from your tribe or what to a chieftain or an important person in the tribe of the people you're trying to make peace with, and vice versa. So, at this point, two of the African women marry into the Filipino families, and some of the Filipino women marry into the African families, further cementing the bond between them. Right? At this time, remember, the Pugot does not exist. So, now, like I said, this is speculation. There's no accurate historical records to prove what I am getting ready to tell you, my peoples in the Philippines. You may know this story as well, or you may not have heard this story. But if you haven't heard this story, well, now you will. Now, you're probably saying, what are your sources, Reese? What are your sources, Omen? How do you know what you know? And we live in the Philippines. We've grown up in the Philippines. We've heard the stories. Yes, you've heard the stories. You've heard the stories that your parents and their parents and their parents' parents told them the story from the Philippines. Now, let me tell you why the story from the Philippines that you know of is not the right story. I do my due diligence. I dig and I dig deep. I dig deep because I want to know. Now, like I told you, where we left off, they were starting to marry into one another's cultures. Now they had formed a culture in about 7 or 8 years, maybe 10 or more, where they had broken off now. You had the ones that tolerated it, didn't mind that the Africans were living in their land, but didn't want to mix with them, simply because they were still unsure that they were, humans. Obviously, once again, you're probably saying, well, some of them are mixing. Well, they were accepting of it, so that's why that happened. Anyway, you had the ones that didn't mind them, but didn't want to mix with them as far as like marriage and stuff. But they didn't have any ill will towards them, just wanted to keep their distance, which was fine. But they still traded with them and everything like that. You had the group that had mixed now, which had become its own separate group. You still had the original African settlers. You still had the original group that was, working with them, living with them and stuff. Then you had the new group, which was the mix between the Africans and the Filipinos. Now, they created their own language totally separate from both of the original languages. They moved off into a very remote area, not because they didn't like anybody else, but because they knew that they had become a separate people, together, but separate. And they also knew that there was a group that didn't like that they existed at all. There was the group that didn't like the Africans. Remember, they were plotting, preparing for what you're about to find out. Now, it's been close to probably 50 or 60 years at this point. They've lived, they've loved, they've died amongst one another. And there's been peace, no problems, still no Pugot, right? Or Pugot, or Pugot. This is where things get a little bit confusing. At some point, it is believed that a huge festival that the original native Filipinos was having, and I don't know what the name of it is, but there was a festival either for harvest or for hunting, but there was a festival, and this festival took place the same time of year every year, regardless of rain, regardless of weather, whatever. They had this festival. It was like a dedication to their gods or their god, whatever. I don't know. I'm not sure of how things worked as far as religion back then, but I do know that the festival was the turning point for relations between the four groups: the natives that were accepting of the Africans, the natives that didn't like the Africans, and the new group formed by the Africans and the natives. So now you've got the four groups, okay? Pay attention to this. This is where things get a little mixed in. Now, those that were in the group that had mixed, Filipino and African, their features were very similar to the native features, just a little bit darker. Their hair was a little bit different, but they were still smaller in stature. The Africans were still larger in stature, obviously, than their neighbors. So, during the festival, it is said, now this is all speculatory, so don't think that I'm saying that this is true. This is all speculation, folks. It is said that at this festival, one of the Africans, one of the younger Africans, not one of the original ones, but one of the younger ones, had grew tired of, the stories that he had heard of his people, where they were from, and his people where they are now. Where he was from, where his people were from, they were warriors. They didn't make deals with other civilizations. They eradicated them. They were a warrior caste. And him hearing the stories of their warrior caste, take all, we conquer, we rule mentality, and then, he wasn't too happy about this peaceful life that he lived, even though he knew nothing but this peace. I guess genetically he yearned for violence, he yearned for war. So it is said that this young man, the young African, went to the festival, and at the festival he committed crimes. The crime being he attacked and started to kill many people. And of course he was stopped. He was stopped by one of his own. In fact, he was stopped by his father, and he was slain by his father. He had to, do what he had to do. And his father thought, and he faced a lot of backlash from some of the younger Africans for having done this, because number one, it's your son. Number two, hey, why are you doing this for these people? And he had to explain to them the history, but they didn't want to hear that. They didn't want to hear that. The young generation was angry. So it is said that they slew the man who slew his own son to prevent what was about to happen. Now, the group of the Filipinos that did not want to have anything to do with the Africans saw this as their opportunity to get rid of the Africans, to finally say, hey, look, we told you this was going to happen. We told you they could not be trusted. And now we're ready to get rid of them. So, of course, they immediately sprung into action. Now remember, this is a very peaceful tribe of people. They were not a warrior tribe. They were not a killing tribe, but they knew how to kill. They knew how, if necessary, to wage war. And the way in which they waged war was a way that no person had ever seen, ever, especially the Africans. They were used to being in large open plains in the part of the country, the part of the continent they came from. It was all open land, rolling hills. You could see your enemy for miles. You knew what you were fighting. But this jungle, this dense jungle with brush and underbrush and low canopies, and it was not something that they were used to fighting in. And they were massacred. Massacred. The Filipinos were coming from the trees. Men, women, children, gone. No survivors. See, one of the Africans wasn't in the camp in their village at the time. He had been off visiting the group of Filipinos and Africans that had, become their own. Let's just call them Filipinos, for the sake of, not confusing things. Black Filipinos, we're going to call them Filipinos, or Blasians. We'll call them Blasians. I hope that is not a term that offends anyone, and if it does, please tell me in the comments and I won't use it again. But for the sake of keeping all the parties, separated, we're going to call the Asians, the Filipinos that have mixed with the Africans, the Blasians. Okay, so the Blasians, he was off visiting them. When he returns to his village, he sees what has happened. And he is completely and totally enraged. Completely. Now, he was one of the younger generation who kind of yearned for a return to what they were told is their ancestral ways of war, ways of savagery, ways of conquering. And when he returned to his village, a village full of warriors fighting people, even the women fought, and he found nothing but death and destruction. Bodies hung from trees, parts hung from trees, children disemboweled and displayed, not just killed and burned, but displayed, as if this message was to go to the gods themselves to tell them never send any more of these people to our islands. Now, this sent this man, this one survivor, into a rage. And it is said, once again speculated, alleged, that a shriek, a roar, a scream, a yell was unleashed that rattled the air for miles. Hence, the birth of the Pugot. That's just one story of how the Pugot came to be, a vengeful man. Now you say, well, what is one man, and how is this one man going to carry on this story, for so many years? How did this happen? I'll tell you how it happened. When he got there and saw this carnage, saw bodies strewn about, they believed in spiritual energy. In fact, what they believed is that if a slain one of them was slain in a way that wasn't war or glorious, like if it was a sneaky thing, like they were stabbed in the back or, poisoned death, that warrior could then call upon their soul to join in with their soul, creating a super soul, so to speak, and that he would have that energy, that extra power from that deceased soul. Now, of course, it only usually works or is practiced where maybe, they have what they call partner warriors, right? Each warrior is paired. They work as a team, although as a huger group, each warrior has his, soul pair, I guess you could call it, right? The one who, if he is murdered in a sneaky way or a poison way, you absorb his energy. Now, I don't have much history on this African tribe. They're a little known African tribe from the western coast. I want to say, if I'm correct, I'm not 100% sure on the topography of or geography of Africa, but I believe near Senegal. I want to say it's near Senegal that this person came, that this tribe originates from. Anyway, so he is now absorbing the souls of those tormented. He does a ceremony and he calls. Now, he doesn't think what's going to happen to him actually happens. To be honest with you, I don't think he was thinking anything except the fact that everyone he knew, including his own children and his wife, was completely and totally massacred, slaughtered. Slaughtered. He did the ritual, cried. He was in torment, agony, and pain. He couldn't understand why the Filipinos would do this. Because they left, evidence. And the group that left the evidence, the ones that didn't like the Africans to begin with, left evidence that it was the group of the Filipinos who did like the Africans that committed these atrocities. So needless to say, after he does this ritual, he wakes up middle of the night, and he knows what he must do. He knows. The spirits that are now in him demand it. And there are a lot of them. We're talking a few hundred spirits dying in anguish. Children whose lives were snuffed out as infants in their little baskets, sleeping, nestling next to their mother's bosoms. Life snuffed right out. And not in an easy way. Some of these small children were tortured to death. And you're saying, who tortures a baby? They did. They wanted to send a fucking clear message that they wanted no Africans on their land. Allegedly. So, of course, imbued with this new power and this rage and this want for revenge and vengeance, he leaves off in the middle of the night. He says, I will bring to them the terror that they brought to my people. I will drop from the trees upon them. They will never see me until it is too late. And for many years, he preyed upon the good Filipino people that had helped his people. Preyed upon them. Year after year after year after year, many would go missing and be found brutally beaten, savaged, destroyed. There was only one, so they knew of. And he reigned terror across the land for many, many years. Until supposedly he was destroyed by Suac. Now, of course, there are many different accounts as to who Suac actually was. Some say Suac was the leader of the people who did not want the Africans to be there. Others say Suac was the leader of the people who were welcoming of the Africans. And there's others who say that Suac was the leader of the people who had become the Blasians. And in my story, at least from what I've gathered, Suac was the head of the Blasians. And he felt that this thing that was created out of hatred for one another, when both were working very well together to begin with, had to be stopped. Because what it meant was that his people would face the same fate, right? So he was worried about his people, and he figured by getting rid of this Pugot, this would save his people. The people would know that he was the one who rid them of this Pugot. Now, remember, the story says he goes on to, control the islands, or at least that region of islands. And I'll tell you why. Because what ended up happening is exactly what he thought would happen. And it was that the people, the good Filipino people, were now aligned with the bad ones. And I say bad only because it's never good to murder anybody, whether they're on your land or not, especially women and children. There could have been a nicer way of going about things, but this was what they decided to do. They decided to react with violence in a situation that didn't call for it. Now, of course, Suac knew what had to be done. There was nowhere else for them to hide, nowhere else for them to run. They were used to the area that they were living in. It was given to them. They knew this was given to them, just like it was given to the Africans, but they also knew that these people, if they decided to, would take it away. So he did the one thing that he thought was the right thing to do to save his people. And he trained the men of his tribe, the men of his people, in the ways of what they would now call the Pugot. They weren't monsters, so to speak, although some of the tactics that they used to protect themselves could be seen as extremely monstrous. And the reason why, at least from this aspect, from what I've researched on the story, the reason why the Pugot legend still goes on to this day is because of what Suac had to do in order to ensure the life and livelihood of his people. And that was to, like I said, train them in the ways of the Pugot warrior, which was why they're always in trees. And they do wear a special headdress, which makes it seem as if they have no head. And it has a reddish, they put sort of like a red dye and paint on the top of it to make it look like the head was decapitated. So it looks like the man, like they're, and they're black. So they look like what's been told. They are mixed of the African and Filipino. So they are a darker people than what's normally in that area. So therefore, it goes on. And since they're wearing the headdresses, it makes them look taller than they actually are. So to this day, that small group of Blasians, which is probably numbering in the hundreds by now, maybe even thousands, still roams in the uncharted, undiscovered, and untraveled jungle regions of the Philippines. In many different places, they've spread out. And whenever they feel as if people may be encroaching on their territory, what they will do is either show themselves just in the trees and scare people off, or in some cases, it has been known that they will come out of the trees and harass people, mostly taking their food and such. Every now and then, a Pugot will claim the life of an unsuspecting victim. But there are people who believe that these people, these murders and things that happen, or these missing people, are simply going missing by regular means, and it's being blamed on the Pugot. Now, I know that they are still here. I know that they really truly exist, and that there are people who are still trying to protect themselves from the world. You know what I'm saying? So that they can live their way of life, which is peaceful and harmonious. But in order for them to attain and keep and maintain that peaceful, harmonious life that they're used to, they had to create the legend of the Pugot. Now, that is not to say that there are not some legends of the Pugot. Now, remember, the Pugot is just a term for goblin and ghost. This particular group of goblins and ghosts are not really goblins or ghosts, but their story would make you think that perhaps they could become goblins and ghosts. Now, there are other Pugot stories, and I will read them to you, but I must say that I will have to travel back to the Philippines in order to do so, because I've got another country to hop into for the next leg of ghost stories from the world with Omen. And our next stop, folks, is still in the area that I'm in. I mean, obviously, I'm not going to jet set from one side of the world to the other. That would make no sense. We have plenty of ghoulish, ghostly tales to tell right here in the region of Asia, which I think, from some of the stuff that I've looked at and some of the things that I've done some research on, Asian ghost stories are very interesting. In fact, a lot of their ghost stories have a lot of real history attached to them. And if you really go digging into it, you may find that some of these ghost stories are actually historical tales, which would explain the culture of the people who are telling the ghost stories a lot more so than history books, right? One thing that I love about reading stories from people that have been passed down from a grandmother to a niece to a nephew and so on and so forth is that although some of the details may change over time, of course, the sentiment, the context remains the same. You know, when something is written, like I said, you can change details, you can change places, you can change locations, but it's very hard unless you completely and totally rewrite something to change the context in which it was written. And the context which this was written tells you that at some point during the time of the Filipino people, they were not used to blacks of any kind. Dark people were different to them. And just like with those who had seen white-skinned people for the first time, or maybe whites that saw blacks for the first time, it was something different they had never seen or heard of. And a lot of times, when we are unfamiliar with things, it scares us, especially if it's bigger than us, or does things that we are not used to, or speaks in a language that we do not speak. These things can cause fear and misunderstandings. And misunderstandings and fear can cause violence to be the choice or the go-to choice for handling whatever situation is there. So, what am I saying when I say that? I'm saying, folks, that read stories. Read stories. You learn a lot about a people from reading their stories. But like I said, folks, hopping on the flight, well, I hopped on the flight shortly after I finished doing my investigation into the Pugot. Told some people in the town that, yeah, it's a ghostly creature. I didn't want to let them know that it's not a ghostly creature, but actually a tribe of people still trying to maintain the ways of their ancient culture, uninhibited and untouched by modern man. And that they will do so by any means, as long as it means that nobody knows where they are. So, folks, I hope you guys enjoyed the story today. I enjoyed telling it, as I do any of the stories that I tell. And our next stop in Asia is going to be Indonesia, which I believe share, which is not uncommon that they would, but share some of the same ghost stories, but with their own take on it. So, I hope you guys will tune in to the next ghost stories from around the world when we check out what's going on in the paranormal world of Indonesia. Thank you once again, folks. Have a wonderful day.